Hello and welcome to the State of America Summit, New Ideas in Civic Life. Just a few months before the midterm election, we gathered together in a spirit of hope for the future of America by celebrating the people and ideas that are pushing our democracy forward. In this spirit, we're joined by some of the leading minds and most inspiring voices from the worlds of government, technology, advocacy, and academia. With them, we seek to answer important questions such as, how can we govern at the national and local levels more efficiently and fairly? How do we overcome economic and social inequality? What investments in new ideas and technologies can we make to reimagine democracy? Before we dive into these conversations, I want to take a moment to thank a few people. First, I want to express our gratitude to the summit's lead sponsor, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, a very generous contribution from which is not only supporting today's forum, but a series of pro-democracy talks and lectures at 92NY, which together are known as the Newmark Civic Life series of Recanati Kaplan Talks. I also want to express our gratitude to all of you for joining us today here online. If you find today's summit to be stimulating and thought-provoking, we hope you'll visit our website at 92ny.org to learn more about the wide range of programming offered at the 92nd Street Y, New York. There, you'll also see the many ways in which we remain committed to civic life, gathering people both in person in New York City and virtually around the globe. Following today's program, we encourage you to participate in a brief survey so that we can more effectively curate events that help inform and inspire civic minds and civic actions going forward. We appreciate your feedback. And now, let's start today's event. Thank you again for engaging with us and for tuning in.
I'd like to welcome everyone watching online for the State of America Summit. We're seriously celebrating new ideas in civic life. I'm Craig Newmark. I'm probably better known as the founder of Craigslist, but for a long time now, I've been focusing my work at Craig Newmark Philanthropies to support the organizations and initiatives that are really serious about protecting our country and our democracy, and efforts that promote fairness, opportunity, and respect for everyone. I am really proud to be the lead sponsor of this summit and of the Newmark Civic Live series at 92nd Street Y, particularly now with the midterm elections coming really soon. Now more than ever, we must embrace, invest, and innovate our civic lives and institutions, because that's what helps protect our country and our democracy. We have a lot of serious experts brought here today. They're going to explore all this, and that's why I'm working with 92nd Street Y. It's a genuine major convener for the people and ideas that will shape and secure the next 250 years of our country and our democracy. Thanks for participating and making the State of America as a real thing and as a real part of your civic journey. Now, let's start the summit.
Well, hello. I am excited here today to be a part of 92NY and the State of America Summit, How We Govern, and to be able to be in a conversation with my good friend, Mayor Eric Garcetti from the great city of Los Angeles. Mayor, how are you today?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you, Michael. I miss you in our service, but I'm so glad to be in conversation with you and soon joining your ranks.
Well, thank you. Thanks for being a part of this. You know, as the series title, How We Govern, you're in office and you have served in a number of different capacities and continue to provide incredible service, not just to Los Angeles, but to so many across the United States. And because of your international work and perspective and focus on issues of climate and so many others, you're serving the rest of the world at the same time. What I wanted to do, obviously, we're going to talk about how we govern, but I'd really like to more fully introduce people and really get your perspective when you look at your electoral history, just your electoral history. Coming into office in 2001, literally a few months before the tragedy of 9/11. Going through city council, and at the time as president of the council during the Great Recession, surviving that, and then in a technically maybe post-recession environment, becoming mayor of Los Angeles. 2020, we had a worldwide pandemic, fiscal distress, racial strife, and the murder of George Floyd, and so many others before him and after. Kind of a crazy presidential election and an insurrection, what I call the 13th month of 2020. You've seen a lot.
Yeah.
You've seen a lot. And so talk to us a little bit before we get into the day-to-day, what it's like to be mayor thing. What has that been like to go through all of those leadership challenges and changes and see it all play out and be a responsible person in elected office?
Well, it's such a great question and a humanizing one at a moment when we sometimes take our leaders, and not necessarily always in bad ways, but we dehumanize them. We don't think of actual human beings with strengths and weaknesses, with amazing attributes and fragilities governing us. We don't think of folks as peers, we think of them as titles. And yet we're human beings, as you know, who live through these moments, first and foremost as fathers and husbands, as neighbors, as human beings. And, you know, as we just marked 21 years and 20 years of commemoration since 9/11, just earlier this month, as we kind of think back in those moments, we were hit by the Great Recession. And then, of course, the trauma we still carry from this pandemic. A couple things. I would say, one, the years tell us things the days cannot see. Two, those of us that serve, we joke with each other privately, but I'll share publicly. They're like dog years, right? A year at City Hall is like 7 years of human life. And both good and bad, you get to live. Good and bad, you get to live with, you know, more things in a week than most people experience in a year of those kind of traumas or triumphs. And then I think third, the most important piece is you're also sometimes, not just you as a leader, but your city and our democracy is defined not by the things we set out to do and how well we do them, as critical as those are, for challenges we know, but the things we don't expect to happen and how we respond to them. That's the insurrection. That's a pandemic. That's, you know, a recession or a terrorist event. And it's a real strength test, you know, of our system and of ourselves collectively as leaders. And I always think I tell my city, my whole city is full of leaders, all 4 million of you, in our ability to respond to that. And I think I've seen some of the toughest moments, but more often than not, I've seen some of the most resilient, hopeful moments where at least I can get up the next day, even when you don't want to get dressed on some of those toughest days. And I can summon that strength because I've seen it in somebody who demonstrated it the day before.
Yeah. No, I mean, a lot has happened over this time, and yet you continue to serve and want to serve. And so, I mean, clearly that is your calling. It is a spirit and a force within you. And first and foremost, I really just want to thank you and commend you for you continue to provide that leadership. And, you know, and the thing we know about politics, you know, there's always the next person, whenever that is. You know, it's the longest running relay race of mankind, and you know, and then we go on to do other things. You mentioned as you were going through all that, you talked about democracy. I don't know about you, but you know, and I mean, I'm only 65, and the country is, you know, 200 plus, but it just seems like it's never been more fragile. it's never been more questioned. And we've had some really tough times in this country. I mean, we had the revolution, we had the Civil War, we've had world wars, all of these things have happened over time. But talk to us about democracy, and not just at the national level. We see all that activity, but I mean, real democracy takes place on the streets of Los Angeles, on the streets of Philly, in New York, in Chicago, small towns, medium and large. And so why is it important?
Well, I know it feels that way whenever democracy is under attack, but I would offer that democracies are much stronger and more fragile than we ever imagined. I think in those moments where there's not big challenges, we're always more fragile than we imagine, because it's made up of us, not these rules or institutions or borders that are written someplace. I mean, we know those have changed throughout human history. So we think of them because we inherit them in America, where we've been told a narrative of this immense stability, that's what keeps it together. But it's really us that keeps it together, and we're fragile. At the same time, when we feel like, oh my gosh, democracy is under attack, and you cited it yourself. I mean, imagine living through revolution where neighbor versus neighbor were killing each other, civil war, Black Americans or women were not even part of the picture. That felt like probably democracy was pretty bad back then too, when immigrants who were the citizens of this country were deported over the border during the Depression to a country they didn't even know anymore. I mean, those are moments where democracy is really under attack and where we could have gone a lot of different directions. But I do think it's a good question, because right now I've been kind of talking about it as the three commons. I just came up with this month, the three commons: the common decency, common ground, and the common good. And in my lifetime, probably like what you're articulating, I haven't felt all three as eroded as ever before. Common decency seems to be hard to find. Common ground is like an afterthought. And the common good, which both those have to be in place to find, we turn on each other, finding enemies within instead of our enemies without. And so I think it is a moment where, we have to tweak democracy to open up space for public decency so that we can talk about what common ground we want to cover and what the common good looks like. And don't delegate democracy. I think the thing that depresses me the most is because we live in such a consumer society, we delegate democracy. Well, I voted in the Philly mayor's election. Mayor Nutter, just fix it. When, and even whether it's a presidential election, or I've even noticed in other state and local elections, when candidates say, well, only I can fix this and I will do this. Well, I has never fixed anything. We have fixed things. And that's really the question. Will we each find that common decency, that common ground, that common good, and compromise, the dirtiest word in politics right now, to make sure we get more of what we want, acknowledging we never get all of what we want.
Yeah. And the ability, compromise is actually how you get stuff done, right? And, whether I was a member of city council, when I was in the council, or even as mayor, and both of us have had, we've been on both sides of that, of that equation. And, some days it's like you're going to get 80%. Grab it, take it, run with it.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I always told people, I am going to come back for the other 20 at some point. But today I'm just going to take the 8.
But even 5% is better. 5% is better than 0%. Yeah. And the next day you come back for another 5%, build it like a loaf of bread, one slice at a time. Right. And I think for people, it's like, if I don't have 100%, we have failed, you have failed, and I'm taking my toys and I'm going home.
Right. Yeah. Well, you definitely don't get anything done in that regard. I guess depending on who you talk to and where you are and watch behavior, I've not yet been ready to utter the phrase, I guess, post-pandemic. We're certainly post the start, and no one has yet declared it over, and it's not. You mentioned something earlier about, I would, Mayor, and I'm sure you had the same experience. I would tell my staff, my schedule is an estimate of what might happen today. And then there's the reality, right? So, we go back to February, March of 2020, we're and you're obviously on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast, you were hearing probably more about it because, people were maybe coming from different places into California. Here on the East Coast, it was like, it's kind of like a West Coast thing to some extent. And, and we can get into, leadership or lack thereof. But, I painfully watched, you and so many others who were in office at the time, and some people have left, where you suddenly went from, cutting ribbons and making speeches and reading to kids, and you're literally having press conferences every day about how many people are sick, how many people are in the hospital, how many people sadly died. We can't fight what we can't see. We don't really know what it is, and we're scared out of our minds to even be near anybody. There's no testing and no vaccine. Talk to us about, again, how we govern, right? I mean, the day before the shutdown, ours was like March 12th. March 10th, I was out and about somewhere, right? When this thing happens, I mean, what do you do?
Well, it was unlike anything we'd ever faced. And I learned lessons literally within weeks. And I learned some lessons before that date. We mark it as that date of closure, but we could feel the storm clouds. We could kind of see the waves coming. I mean, there was something happening, even if we couldn't articulate it and we had never lived through it. I mean, we're like, people wear masks. Like I've seen some Japanese people do that, or maybe in Hong Kong, I watched some people wear masks, but all these things that we were about to undergo, we didn't know. One, which I always found, you're right about schedule. And I've always said, there's kind of four things you can do. You can get briefed and learn information. You can have time to reflect and make decisions and vision. You can check in on your relationships, and you can take care of yourself. And usually we do mostly the first. Right. As leaders, because so many people want to tell so many things that we have to know in case somebody asks us something. So all day long, you're being passive, just collecting information of dozens of departments, occasionally making a decision. Right. That second one, where you have time to reflect, I carved out at the beginning of this. And I started at night when people were doing less and less stuff, just reading the medical journals and historic journals about, learning that in medieval times, like when there was pandemics, they'd take the Lord out of the manor and chop their head off. I said, people are going to be upset. Like when people are dying, things bad happen. When I looked at how innovation happened, LA versus San Francisco in the 1917, 1918 pandemic, arguably the quick decisions in LA helped LA to recover faster and really displaced San Francisco as the bigger city and the main city in the state. It was like some very interesting lessons that happened. So to me, the four things I tried to do was accelerate. And I told people, usually, as you know, in government, wait for somebody else to do it, see if they screw it up, then decide if you're going to. But I'd rather be an architect. And I said, if this is life and death, I'd rather make the decision, correct it tomorrow if it's wrong, or the next day. So accelerate, innovate. You have to try things you've never done before. I took my fire department, for instance, because we didn't have a public health department. That was a county responsibility here in LA. So we suddenly turned firefighters, who are medical professionals, into the testers when nobody was doing that. Third, collaborate. We found folks to work with them. Sean Penn's organization, founded after the Haiti disaster in the past, called CORE, became our main civilian group together with those firefighters to test people and then communicate. And that was the toughest and most exhausting thing, I think, for most of us as leaders to do. I was on the news at 6 o'clock every night, every channel, English for almost an hour and then Spanish for almost an hour. And as sick as I got of my own voice, so many people still come up to me saying, that was the thing that kept me going. And how you communicate isn't just, here's the desk, here's the things you have to do. You have to empower people not to be powerless in the moments of greatest need. Give them a role, place them in the midst of this as somebody active, even if they're at home, unable to leave. And I think those were the lessons I learned in emergency. Relentlessly communicate, try things you've never done before, do it faster than ever, and bring in partners.
Yeah. Talk about, we know, it is more than true about, we have all these sayings, local government is where rubber meets the road and it's real. And do all these high level things, but people still do want the trash picked up. They'd like a smooth road to ride on. They'd like the street lights to work, all the while you're, saving society, saving democracy. Talk about the relationship. And again, because of your time span, you've seen a variety of administrations, whether at the federal level or at the state level. Talk about the importance of that relationship between and among local, state, federal, to what I always refer to as GSD. For this broadcast on 92 NY, we'll leave it at Get Stuff Done. But talk about the intersection of those entities and how you make all that work.
Well, when folks ask me kind of who inspired me as mayor, and not just because you're interviewing me, I always talk about Martin O'Malley, Mike Bloomberg, Michael Nutter. Those who came before me, who I always saw were beginning to really try to quantify what we do. Because so much of governance is kind of a quality thing, but it's also a political thing, like low-hanging fruit, just say you did it. See, guys, I was successful, but most people never had a light shine on the operations of their local government. They couldn't keep us accountable because we weren't holding ourselves accountable. We weren't measuring things using kind of that comp stat model. So I came in and re-interviewed all of my general managers, really integrated that. We're picked by Bloomberg What Works Cities, the first platinum level city in the country, of using data to govern. And how that interacted with the federal and state government is now I could go to them. And the dirty little secret is even when you have a friendly administration, they're always calling local government saying, hey, we want to do something on gun violence, on the environment, on gender equity, on immigrants. What are you doing? So then they kind of bring together 4 or 5 things. They might try to push that up as policy, or brag about that they're helping, give us some grants maybe for things. And really, most work is done at the local level. When you and I founded Climate Mayors, the organization of U.S. mayors across Democrat, Republican, and independents to look at climate change, I used to joke when President Trump was elected, and suddenly he said we were going to withdraw from Paris, and we got on the phone with climate mayors and got 300 plus to say, well, if he's out, we're in. We probably were more motivated to do that local work stuff than if it had been President Clinton. If Hillary Clinton had been president, we would have been lazier about our own local stuff. So never see that power you have, but also never don't have relationships. In the Trump administration, a friend who worked at the Office of Management and Budget, the night they were doing relief to states, when we were all spending money we didn't know if we had, but we were trying to save our people's lives, paying for these testing centers, et cetera, said, what do you need? Because we had kept our lines open, and he was from LA and a great person. And I said, well, cities need money too. And he changed it that following hour in the negotiations with Congress, and cities above 500,000 got money from my city. That was nearly $800 million overnight. So don't become so partisan that you can't find good people, no matter who's in the White House, who's running Congress. And I think that's a lesson that you learn too, is don't get too hyper partisan. Be a proud partisan, fight for the values you believe in. But a lot of stuff doesn't have an R or a D next to it. It's aid for everyday people.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to your common ground. The other one might be common sense,
Yes.
Which, as we know, sometimes not all that common. There are other things going on in the world, or which are our little part of the world. Federal regulations, federal laws, the Supreme Court seems like, every couple of months they rule on something that if I had hair, sets our hair on fire. How does that impact, again, what goes on at the local level? Often our citizens respond to these things, and then you're the local person. You might actually be in agreement with your citizens, but they're still, if I can say on this broadcast, they're still pissed off about something, and they want a response from you.
Well, look, on one hand, it could be really helpful when it comes through like the recent Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure legislation. When you were head of the U.S. Conference of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, you appointed me to head up a new infrastructure task force, and so for 7 years we were always that close to getting an infrastructure package. When it finally passes, that means real material things to the 15 rapid transit lines we're building out here and moving forward before the Olympics come in. It means something for our port, which we saw the supply chain woes with just a few months ago, that brings 40% of the goods into America from Philadelphia to Maine to Florida to Seattle. And so it can be a force for really good things. And lately we've been seeing a more productive Washington than I can ever remember. And that's even in some very good years, as I saw them under Obama, Biden. On the other hand, when it would be seen much more hostile, whether it was the Trump administration on certain core values or the Supreme Court, I would also remind people that just as I said, even when Washington passes climate legislation on things like credits for buying electric cars or chargers, we've actually been doing that for a decade plus in the city of Los Angeles and the state. So most of the power when it's good times is still at the local level. But all that power exists in bad times too. We've made this a place where women's right to abortion is protected, where if people come from out of state, the state is looking at, can we reimburse people who come from states where that isn't allowed and where they don't have those freedoms? Sometimes the federal government will trump us under the federal system, no pun intended. It will, just because of federalism. But most of the time, you can show America where that power is and don't cede that exercise before you try to exercise it. So don't cry in a corner, get on the phone, talk to other local communities, and change America one community at a time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit more about you and some of the things that you've been doing, again, through the career, but certainly your time as mayor. And I proudly served on the certification team for Los Angeles. You are an innovator. You are known as a leader, person that takes reasonable, practical risks to get things done and represent the best interests of your citizens. Talk a little bit about some of the bold initiatives that you've taken, and especially on the communications, civic engagement, participation. We talk about politics as well in Philly. We talk about politics as a full contact sport, but it's also, democracy is participatory, right? Appreciate you going to vote 2 times a year, hopefully, but the other 363 days of the year, you still have to be involved. Yeah. Right. Just don't send us to city halls, to state houses, or even to the White House or the halls of Congress and think that your job is done. And so talk about how do you keep people engaged?
One of my favorite writers, Ernst Renan, the French writer, once said that the nation is a daily plebiscite. In other words, we think about it only being on election day, but you and I know it's actually all the time in between election day. If you're not voting every day, if you're not participating every day, then don't complain if the city, you should expect city government to work, and it shouldn't get any headlines when it does. I'm not going to pat myself on the back that for 40 years, our roads in Los Angeles were going down in their rating, and for 9 years, they've finally gone up. Last year, when 140 ships were outside the LA port, it was international news. Now there's 7. There's no headline saying, congratulations, LA, the ships are in, because that's what we're supposed to do. And I get that as a job. But at the same time, there's a limit, to the 400 people who work in the mayor's office, the 40,000 that work in the city government can do compared to the 4 million citizens that are directly under me and the 10 million even in our metro area, that we can engage and inspire to do things. So a few different things. We're going deep with participatory budgeting, actually giving money to communities where they can vote and decide and feel like City Hall isn't distant, but 9 million for 9 different communities to say this is where we want it to go, something called LA Repair. It can be the mailing of ballots, which should be in every state in America, and California now does and is boosting our voter turnout. It's our civic university, something I used to call Government 101, but I was a professor before I got elected, and I used to joke I had all the time in the world to think about things and no power to do anything. Now I had all this power to do things and no time to think. And I realized people don't understand what city zoning is. They don't know how a budget's put together. They usually get a week to respond to it after we put it out instead of building it during the year. And so we have a whole curriculum with Cal State Los Angeles here, where we've been training our neighborhood councils and community groups to understand how you get a park, how you advocate for things, what the budget is about, how you run for office. And we've moved away from that civic education, certainly for our youth, but it should be lifelong learners that do that as well. And then lastly, we've kind of opened up our books and said, look, I want you to see what I see. So as soon as I was doing this during the pandemic, all the data that we had, every night we put out in a data deck. And I said, whatever I know, you're going to know that same hour. And we've been doing that with our open data work. Number 1 in America, ranked almost every year, because we want people to manipulate that data, tell us what we're missing, tell us where we're screwing up, but also propose proactive solutions that might come from a hacker or from a student or from a retired individual with great potential to help us solve that challenge.
You're reminding me, the folks, they've done a great thing by, of course, hopefully they think so at the end, putting us together. The only challenge of people like you and I being together is that we have 9 million stories and only time for 8 of them. But one of the things you mentioned during the Great Recession, I mean, we're cutting services and raising taxes, doing all, I mean, the 2 worst things to do at the same time. Basically, I'm going to cut your service and charge you more for it. But we brought in some folks to help citizens understand the budget and how do you construct it. And right. So, they had a certain amount of quote unquote money. And then here's the cost of these services. And I'll never forget one night, people are struggling and, if you want more of this, you got less of that and, making these decisions. And a guy walked up to me and said, Mayor, this is really hard. And I said, yeah. And try doing it for real.
Remember President Trump said that after about a year or 2? He's like, this governance is really hard. It's like, yeah, welcome to the party.
Right. So, couple rapid fire things, but certainly want to get perspective. Voting rights in various places under attack, civil liberties, campaigns, elections, seemingly getting, nastier and nastier, just, with candidates. I mean, I'm not saying that it was ever, kind of touch football, but I mean, it's become really, really nasty in so many ways. How do you, the pundits and others, may love the blood sport, but at the end of the day, you still got to keep people energized and help them to see that something positive can come out of all this. How do you, and then the information, misinformation, disinformation, roll all that in it together. How do you keep things straight?
Well, I think you have to go back to an earlier place than just hoping public comment will clean itself up. You have to actually, I think, tweak some parts of democracy right now. At the local level, Philly may be the same. Our sunshine laws, like anybody can speak anytime, anywhere. One of the positive things of the pandemic is people could do that without having to drive to City Hall anymore. But it was also hijacked that if you listen in, it's usually people saying F you, F you, F you the entire time. And that had happened in chambers. So I don't serve on the city council. Some mayors do, but I've watched how somebody shows up for the first time and they go, oh my God, I'm never coming back here.
Right.
And I think there is such a thing as so much speech and threats and disruption that it no longer is about the content of speech. It is about creating something that degrades and erodes democracy. That's part of the common decency and the common sense, that you and I were talking about. And there's been some tweaks to that with California state law. Visiting people's homes as opposed to places of business. I mean, when people say, should I run for office? I kind of give them the advice an acting teacher once told me, only if you can't not. It depresses me to say that. But, at this point, only do it if you can't not. Whereas I want a lot of people who would do it just because they think they maybe should. But it comes at such a price. Even when the Supreme Court justices were having their homes protested out, I was like, just walk me through the strategy there. Why that won't just harden somebody when they get into protect family mode to whatever it is you're saying. There's not going to be an aha moment. It's going to be the opposite. Let's be smart, not just, and we can be on the news and seen in as much force in a public space outside of private spaces.
Right.
What worries me about how we fix it is I think we need to see disruption's always been a part of democracy. I participated in disruption. I studied disruption when I was a student. It was necessary for civil rights, for women's rights, for gay rights, for immigrant rights, for so many things. But there was always a plan to disrupt and then come across the street indoor and negotiate.
Right.
And right now it's kind of about the Instagram. It's about the cool post. I confronted the man. Look at me. I'm so powerful. It's about the narcissism of activism rather than the effectiveness. So I don't have quick answers, but it's something collectively we have to ask ourselves of how we imbue a different culture and how we put some limits on so much freedom that we actually degrade our collective freedom and our individual freedoms and inspirations to participate. I don't blame most people that they don't want to get into the fray anymore. And I think one last thing I'll leave you with on this question is maybe it's at that local level we have the best shot at that, because we feel very strongly about abortion, probably one way or the other. We'll still fight for those values, but we also have some places where there's true common ground, where it's not black and white, where we can work within those grays, find some common ground and move things forward, make people feel good in a way they materially see. Oh, that park, that new park, that looks great. That street is smooth. Oh, there's trees on this hot day. there's things that affect me. There's a guaranteed basic income. There's a minimum wage that went up, whatever it is,
Right.
where we can actually find that common ground. And I think get people more enthused about democracy.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about, again, because of many innovative things you've been involved with, use of technology. You know, I've come to say, especially with some of our younger generations, you know, we have more access to more information than ever in the history of mankind. Yet from time to time, it feels like we know less and are more confused.
That's very true. And I think as policymakers, we feel that all the time. But I will say the positive is what probably used to take years to find out and to look for, we can do in a 20-minute search.
Right.
One of the most moving moments of my life was, at least my elected life, my professional life, was at the beginning of the pandemic, a chair of C40, the 96 largest cities in the world's mayors, really looking at climate change. But I hit the bat signal. It was my second Zoom, I think, ever. And across all the time zones of the world, we had like 70 of those mayors, maybe 60 something to 70 of those mayors. Incredible feat in itself. I'd never had that many, you know, mayor of London, Tokyo, Jakarta, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, all these together, come together to talk about what was happening. And the mayor of Seoul, the late Mayor Park, may his memory be a blessing, he talked about drive-through testing, which none of us had ever heard about. Mayor Sala of Milan, remember, this is when northern Italy had the biggest onslaught of people dying. He said, this is how you're going to have to get your hospitals ready so fewer people die in their hallways. I mean, very sobering stuff. But by the next day, we were doing it. That's why I made LA the first place to test people without symptoms, the first place to mask in the country, one of the very first to shut down, the first to halfway shut down. Because I heard this, I saw it. And in other words, mayors could move extremely quickly because of this information.
Right.
When I talked to Mayor Khan, my successor as chair of C40 and the mayor of London, he talked about meeting with Boris Johnson, telling him about that call and all these things. And then Prime Minister Johnson turned to his staff and said, did we know this stuff? And they said, yes, but we're preparing a report. We're going to give it up to you for some decisions to make. Then you'll talk to other national leaders. And that's like a weeks to month long process as opposed to minutes long. So I think information has been very helpful in that sense. And technology, like you said, yeah, you can flood people with it. Open data, I don't know what all the data sets are, but I know that people, sometimes it's a reporter pulling something out saying, did you know this about your response times at the fire department? You better get on that. Or it may be, you know, again, that hacker, when we do a hackathon, saying here's a better way to deal with water waste in the midst of a drought. And so, you know, whether it's just the raw data or the last thing as a data geek I'll put out there, what I've loved doing is Esri, which is one of those companies that does the GIS, you know, the graphical information systems, worked with us. And we became the first city to start something called City Hub, or sorry, GeoHub. It's at geohub.lacity.org. And you can see how we use data to tell a story. So when somebody says, hey, why aren't my streets paved? You can click on a temporal map that shows you over the last 8 years, the streets getting paved and just how many have gotten paved and what's coming next. Because sometimes if they know it's coming in 3 years, okay, I'd rather have it next week, but I know it's coming. Right. And we have to use data to tell stories. So I would say this, information by itself isn't enough. We have to narrate it. And we have to let others narrate it to us. And then information usually is a net gain for everybody.
Last question. Ordinary citizens, whoever fits in that descriptor, because, you know, we're all unique and special people. But, you know, the folks who are not on a day-to-day sitting around trying to figure out these things, I often tell my elected friends, you know, the public pays nowhere near as much attention to us as any of us would like. And the reason is because they have real lives. They have things going on. They have things to do, right? They're working, they're trying to pay the rent, the mortgage, the car note, kids off to school, take care of parents, what's going on my block, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, we don't actually capture that much of their day-to-day attention, nor should we. But ultimately, they're the boss. What can citizens do?
Well, first of all, it is on us, and I think we should be part of their day-to-day life. They participate enough to elect us. It's not for our egos, because I think, after about a week, any of the glamour of the job wears off. But you are elected to be kind of a parent in chief, a protector in chief, a collaborator in chief.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting work to do that. During the pandemic, I learned, though, what it meant to humanize who you are and to humanize the stories of the city through a person. Because right now, unlike friends that we have or neighbors, where we'll be like, yeah, we don't agree on 100%, but I like that person because of X, Y, and Z. All we fixate on for our leaders, and that might not just be an elected leader. It may be the person giving you a parking ticket. It may be a public servant wearing a badge. It may be whomever. We dehumanize them too, based on what we don't like about them, or we don't like what they've done. And so I think first and foremost, what regular people can do is to remember these are neighbors who step forward into service. And yeah, we can all find the maintenance hole cover where there's 10 people standing around. We're like, hey, the city workers don't work. There might be a good reason, or we might be able to find those exceptions, but you can find them in the private sector. You can find them anywhere. That's just human beings. We can find the cop that's bad. We can find, the elected official who takes bribes. All those things are out there, but there's a lot of public servants who really are your neighbors seeking to serve. Second, they're not an alien class. You are them and they are you. So what can you do to do something in between? I was just in Japan, coming back from the U20, which is the G20 Urban Forum in Jakarta. I stopped there and some of my staff's like, gosh, Tokyo's so clean. I wonder what their government does differently. I said, well, it's actually a combination probably of some good governance, but also there's a social compact. There's not even trash cans because people take their trash home and they don't waste as much as we do. So part of this is what can we do to self-organize? Yeah. What can we do to self-motivate? America, remember, is always been, unlike Germany or Italy, that was a nation that was in search of a state. We became a state before we became a nation. In other words, we were the boundaries, even as they changed, before we were a people. And I think right now, what I would say to people out there, it's a less specific answer to your question, but I think the most important is figure out what you love or want to love in the nation of America. It's not good enough just to complain. It's not just good enough to divide. It's not good enough to find the politician or the neighbor that we don't like, the racial group that has done wrong or received wrong. We have to stop dividing ourselves, and we have to figure out a way, even as we tell hard truths to one another, how it is that we will build a nation. And a nation comes with not just rights, but responsibilities. And I think there's no better place than cities to start that. As tough as it is, like Lee Brandeis once said about states being the laboratory of democracy, I would say we are the factories of democracy. We're the ones that actually have to produce day in, day out the widgets that make America work at your local community. And if you think that that factory is going to just be done by robots, you're going to suffer. Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, if you have contempt for government, you will get contemptible government. We have too much contempt for government. And I think the moment we roll that back, we can begin to embrace what it means to live in a democracy and how lucky we are.
That's it.
All right.
Just fantastic. Just fantastic. It's one of those things. I could ask you 10 more questions. You'd hit the rest of those out of the park. But I think that was just a beautiful close. I know there's more service coming in the future. I appreciate you so much. Respect your leadership. Wishing you all the best in that continued journey of public service and leadership. You and your family, be safe. Please be well, and thank you for today.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be with my friend. I can't wait to do it over a beer sometime soon, your city or mine.
Absolutely.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the State of America Summit, exploring new ideas in civic life. This conversation is entitled How We Battle Social and Economic Inequality, and it's brought to you by the 92nd Street Y, New York, and its pro-democracy initiative, the Newmark Civic Life Series. My name is Dr. Carmen Rojas, and I'm the president and CEO of Marguerite Casey Foundation. I am honored to be guiding today's discussion with civic leaders whose important work is helping to guide us towards a more fair and just society. Just briefly, Marguerite Casey is a national foundation that's focused on shifting the balance of power in society to those communities and people who've long been excluded from having it and from sharing in its rewards. We fund local community organizing across the country and are actively exploring the issues at the center of this conversation. I'm so proud to be the moderator of a conversation between Mayor Michael Tubbs and Maya Wiley. Michael Tubbs currently serves as a special advisor for economic mobility and opportunity for California Governor Gavin Newsom. He previously served as the 79th mayor of Stockton, California from 2017 to 2021, and as member of a Stockton City Council from the 6th District from 2013 until 2017. He was elected mayor in 2016, becoming the youngest mayor in Stockton's history and its first African-American mayor. Maya Wiley is a lawyer, professor, and civil rights activist. She has served as president and CEO of the Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights since May 2022. She served as the counsel to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio as well. She chaired the Civilian Complaint Review Board from 2016 to 2017, and you've seen her all over TV, in particular as an MSNBC legal analyst from August 2018 to January 2021. Maya ran in 2021 in New York City's Democratic mayoral primary, placing third. Welcome you both to this conversation. Thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Thank you. It's such a great pleasure to be with both of you.
Thanks for having me.
I'm just going to start with an opening and easy question, and I'll start with you, Mayor Tubbs. What is the state of our nation today when it comes to social and economic inequality?
Never an easy question from you, Dr. Rojas, but appreciate the opening salvo. And I mean, I'm sure Wiley's going to talk about this as well, but make no mistake that the threats to democracy and the rising income and wealth inequality in this country aren't just related, they're correlated, I would argue. If we look at sort of any measure in terms of life expectancy, in terms of mortality of mothers, in terms of sort of safety nets offered to people in tough times, in terms of income mobility. The United States is towards the middle to the bottom of other developed nations on all of those indicators and measures. So this conversation for me is one that's particularly resonant with two young kids who are 3 years old and 1 year old, and thinking about sort of what country will they be born into in 20 years if we don't reverse course now.
Maya, what about you? What are you thinking about as the state of our nation in this moment?
Well, I certainly agree with Mayor Tubbs. I think that just goes without saying. So if I could just sort of add a little bit more maybe texture and detail to what was so powerful that the mayor said. I mean, we're sitting here today in a country that, let's just look at our court system, where the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of our country, has taken a fundamental right away from us, and that is the right to abortion. But this is a perfect example of exactly what Mayor Tubbs is talking about, because what it represents is not only and awfully and offensively having the government stand between a woman and her doctor, stand between her healthcare and her decision over her own dignity, and something as basic and fundamental as when and how to form a family. But let's put that aside. The impacts that this is going to have on the racial and gender wealth divide in this country, in the health divide in this country, is actually going to be significant in those states that have already, and more that will join, in doing exactly that, undermining a fundamental right. We already know that Black women, for instance, are 3 to 4 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related causes, even if they have health insurance. That's inequality, that's racial injustice, that is also going to be exacerbated, particularly when we look at women of color, whether it's on Native American reservations, whether it's in El Barrio or in the hood, because it's really going to be fundamentally a question of wealth, a question of whether or not you actually have the power of the purse to get on an airplane and go someplace that will grant you the ability to keep money in your pocket and be able to feed your babies. Because the one thing we should not forget is that the majority of women and children, because they're not all full grown, making decisions to have an abortion, have children already. And they're actually making an economic decision about themselves and their futures. And the Supreme Court said, you don't have the right to do that anymore. So we could go on and on and on with these kinds of examples. But I will say one thing. Running the Leadership Conference, which is a coalition that looks like the majority of this country, 230 groups strong, but we were founded by A. Philip Randolph, the Black trade unionists. And I think his quote back in the day stands today, which is, if we have a democracy, a community that is democratic, he said, is one in which the humblest and weakest among us have the highest civil, economic, and social equality as those who are the most powerful. We are a very, very, very far way away from that. And that is the gap we've got to close.
I want to stay with you for a little bit. Maya, you did something which I think is so important, which is run for office. And I think oftentimes leaders in the nonprofit philanthropic space have foregone public office. They've surrendered public office. And one of the reasons I was so excited about this conversation with the two of you is it's been clear to me that you both are committed to the state as a governing institution for us that can actually serve us, and the promise of a truly multiracial and just democracy. I'm wondering, on the heels of that, what are some of the lessons that you are bringing into your current role?
Oh, such a good question. And let me just start first by being thankful. I'm thankful for Mayor Tubbs, who showed us how to be bold when he was mayor, when he had ideas like, guaranteed minimum income. And for the Marguerite Casey Foundation, which I've had great privilege to know for a very long time in terms of the investments that you have made in communities of color, power building and activism for such a long time. So both those things are actually very important to running for office, and reinforcing the relationship between having big, bold ideas that actually say we can solve our problems if we're willing to think big rather than small, if we think transformational rather than transactional. And that's also the power of organizing. That's the power of investing in people building power on the ground, those folks who had been humbled and weakened by injustice, but are just as powerful when they're able to use their voice for problem solving. And I saw that in the mayor's race. Something I've always seen in my career, but I saw it politically. That to come out, we talk a lot about how divided we are as a country, and we are more divided than I can remember in my lifetime. And I'm not going to tell you how long that was. Okay, it was 58 years. But here's the thing. The reality is, when you actually start to talk about the problems we share, even when it's across race and class, so many of us share them that we actually start saying things like I did on the mayoral campaign, where I said, I believe that we can create a municipal single payer healthcare system in the city. Now, that was a big, bold idea. And we weren't going to start with just automatically becoming a single payer city. But the reality is, we had all these people working jobs with paychecks, who still didn't have health insurance in a blue state. And of course, once you start to look at people of color, which is 2/3 of the city, that number goes way up. And we thought we could have a way even to get healthcare to undocumented immigrants. So I'm saying those kinds of things because, the lesson was that's what people wanted. And they actually wanted it even across race and class. And another idea And by the way, we sourced this. I think one of the things that was so important to me, and I keep going back to that A. Philip Randolph quote, because he was also talking about our civil society power. He was talking about our civic engagement power. And we wanted to show, and I still want to show that, that's why I'm working for a coalition, that when we engage people in what their problems are, but how to solve them, people come up with really interesting ideas. So a lot of the ways we did this was not just sitting in a room coming up with what would poll well. That's not how we did this. You know, we actually talked to advocates, we talked to organizers, but we also had people's assemblies as a campaign where we talk sometimes across community about any issue, sometimes about a specific issue, but we let people come and bring, you know, not just their experiences and their problems, but the kinds of things they wanted to see from their government. And that, I bring all of that into, you know, being a kind of proud member of a very powerful civil rights and human rights coalition that really, as I said, it looks like the coalition that really is the majority of this country, even when we are not being listened to as if we are the majority. But we are, and we're going to lean hard into that.
I'm so excited to see what you're going to do in this new moment, Maya. Mayor Tubbs, I want to turn to you. Your legacy as a mayor of Stockton is one of experimentation and innovation. Really, you did this thing that I so admire, which is like to plant the seeds in people's imagination of what it looks like when government works for us. And you practiced it. Maya mentioned your guaranteed basic income experiment, but I also know that there were so many other ways that you started to create a possibility of a depth of democracy in people's everyday life in Stockton. And I'm wondering, what are the things that you stand out for you in terms of practices of deep democracy that we should hold close in this moment?
Yeah, well, first, let me say on the guaranteed income front, which I know we'll talk about more later, part is the legacy of Maya's father, who helped start the National Welfare Organization, who would push Dr. King to embrace guaranteed income. So I want to thank you and your family, Maya, for the legacy and for sort of all those years previous planting the seeds and giving the language and the democratic imagination for what we can do. And to answer your question, Dr. Rojas, part of it I realized was this narrative, and it's really about power. And what I mean is that so often when folks are in positions of government or positions of authority, they begin to take on traits as one who decides who has value and who doesn't, or one who's able to ascertain who makes a good decision or not. So I think the most radical thing I did while in government in Stockton was to change that whole paradigm and say, no, government is nothing but people. So the best do is invest in all of our people, particularly those who are on the bottom. And that manifested ourselves in guaranteed income, but also in our land use policies, around climate, on our change in policing. We led the state, the same time we're doing guaranteed income, we reduced homicides by 40% and led the state in declining officer-involved shootings. And it wasn't a perfect place, but it was really about a paradigm shift, in that government wasn't about policing or boxing in or setting boundaries for those people, but government was about investing and serving all people, number one. And then number two, particularly in conversations around race and gender equity, the conversation would always start, at least in my office, with, okay, what did government do? So let's assign culpability. Is there a policy? Is there a procedure? Is there a practice that we actually did that created this outcome? And if so, we have not just the moral responsibility, we actually have the ability to change it, because oftentimes, I know you guys see this in your work, when people have been doing the work for so long, they lose a little bit of energy, a little bit of heart, and think everything's unsolvable. It's like, no, I'm not telling them, we're not going to solve all the problems, but the city of Stockton, we built this freeway in this community, did we not? So what are we going to do to make sure those folks in this community can breathe clean air? Because they can't now because of what we did. And it was really breaking down for my staff, for my council, for the community, that I think really allowed us to think differently about government. And then on the flip side, part of it was also, you spoke about this in the conversation around coalitions, Maya, but part of it was also, how do I get people to believe that government could work for them? Like the only time I've heard from government is, you're towing my car for parking 5 minutes late because I gotta run to the store and get some milk for my baby, or you're running through my door on faulty intelligence, looking for someone who doesn't live here, or you're telling me, I know I owe money because I can't, like all the interactions were so negative that part of it was to get people to see that, like, no, government works for you. And I would tell people all the time, like, it makes sense why people are so like, I understood why my rich constituents expected me to answer their calls. Like, understood why my lower income constituents did not expect me to answer their calls, because when rich people called, the whole government would respond. If one of the fathers or someone with some influence called, everyone with information. I don't have to push nothing. But if grandma or abuela down the street had an issue, I had to like grease the wheels and move things forward. So I think part of it was also reorienting ourselves and knowing that we just have to be responsive to everybody. Like our job is to be as responsive to everyone, and we don't want to keep doing one-off stuff. Let's put the systems and policies in place so that we know there's a schedule for street cleaning we can point people to. There's a schedule for tree trim we can point. There's like so long answer to say, part of what I think was radical was really believing that government can work and that government has to work. And part of it was from just lived experience and knowing that people who of lower means or people who have been historically excluded aren't like dependent on government because they have no agency. They need government to work because they can't opt out. They don't have money for private service. Like the government, public schools have to work. Public transportation has to work. Public safety has to work because they can't hire private security. They can't pay for private schools, and they can't pay they can't privatize the resources. So that was really sort of so I think what was radical was just the agenda and the paradigm. Like, no, this thing can work and it has to work, and it has to work for everybody.
God, I love this last framing, Mayor Tubbs, of you like started to move in this direction, but the tension I think that we're having right now, which feels like a part of the divide, is the belief that private is always so much better than public, that we have been sold for so long, and frankly, unhooking or untethering our belief and commitment to a government that works for us, and wanting to actually privatize more and more things in service of disconnecting us as opposed to like re-articulating or tethering us into a collective, into having a collective vision. For both of you guys, you know, Maya, you started to mention this, like, I am from the Freedom is a Constant Struggle school. I wasn't always of this school. I was sometimes of a school that was like, oh, let's fight to win this policy. We won the policy, we won. And then would be overwhelmed, surprised when it was short-lived, when it wasn't a sustained victory, when people didn't understand, you know, that the victory had become real. You see this in like minimum wage fights all the time, where a city will raise a minimum wage and low wage workers are like, oh, I actually didn't, my employer told me it wasn't about me. And seeing how there's so much work to be done beyond the winning of a policy or the electing of a person. There's like a continuous work of democracy making. And I'm wondering from both of you, and I'll start with you, Maya, in this moment, what are some of the most important fights that you see that we have to continue to struggle to maintain the gains of victory? Look at this. I literally just wish I had a camera to take, because I like to come in light. I like to have a light conversation with easy questions. So
clearly. Well, I mean, first, let me say, Carmen, I mean, clearly it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, and it's actually more like a relay race, because we got to keep passing it. And I thank you, Mayor Tubbs, for mentioning my father. I'm very lucky to have been born to my parents, something I'm always grateful for. And it gave me something that I realize is a very deep privilege, which is the privilege of seeing the long trek. Right? Because, you know, my grandfather was a postal worker who was trying to make sure his daughter could get in the Girl Scouts and his kids could be the first generation college. You know, but then I saw my father and my mother organizing to desegregate schools, but also to get women on welfare enough money to be able to feed them, their families, and keep a roof over their head. And so, you know, when I entered this world of not just work, but of mission, you know, it was this sense of that history and just how long a march it had been, and that I was just one more soldier falling into line, so to speak, right? And I think so. The way I look at it, and I look at, you know, the current state of emergency, because I don't know what else to call it. It's like we are in a place even worse. And I was a high school kid when Ronald Reagan was voted president, so I thought I'd seen some things. It's gotten a lot worse. But I think here's the thing: there are real clear possibilities. And, you know, Mayor Tubbs said it. I saw it on the campaign trail. I see it as an advocate, where when we focus not just on the right fights because the policy is right, like one policy we were fighting on was making sure we could get Medicaid expansion into the 12 states that did not fund Medicaid expansion, right? After Obamacare. And that's 2.2 million people who do not have health insurance, many of them people of color, that would with that expansion. Now, we didn't win that fight, but I think here's my point. That kind of fight, because just as Mayor Tubbs said, there were Black women in Georgia talking about the most important issue to them was whether or not they were going to be able to get some health insurance through Medicaid expansion. So then I'm looking at voting rights, right? Because what I want, and what we all want, is to make sure that we're actually tapping the power that represents, not the problem, but the power. But taking that and saying, well, you know, if we can actually work on getting more turnout at the polls from communities that are saying, we want things like government health care. We want things like more free childcare. We want things like making sure we're getting mental health services in our schools rather than police officers. I mean, because that's what we were hearing from communities. Those are real solutions. And the question is building the power, which is the community organizing that you fund, but it's also making sure that that's linked up with what makes people feel that sense of hope. And not because it's a promise, but because it's a possibility if they show up. It's a possibility if they participate, and that they know, you know, and the one thing about our folks is you don't have to tell them it's not the whole ball of wax, and that they know it. They know it. And so, and frankly, even for middle class white families, I have found this to be true. I mean, education and getting more resources into schools is a top issue for middle class white families. This isn't a, you know, there are all these things that, so I would say, yes, education and real working schools, yes, mental health services, so that we have real, not just crime prevention, which we must have, so we can reduce an abusive criminal justice system, which perpetuates inequality. These are real fights we can win, but it's not going to be fast. But it's also because what we're doing in those fights is getting more resources into the pockets of real people, as we're showing folks what their fight and their participation in the fight produces. So, you know, to me, the number of issues are pretty obvious, and we've been talking about them, and it's because people care about them. And the mechanism is important, and it does take multiple parts of that mechanism, from, you know, getting more, I'm going to say it, we need more people who look like us and think like us and care like us and engage like us in public office. And we also need to field more people and understand, I say this personally, not as the leadership conference, because we're not partisan, but that's part of power. And we can't be afraid. We can't be afraid. Because we believe in democracy, we can't be afraid of more people having power in those positions, because it's our power if we're picking the right people. But it's also making sure that accountability is there, because people are showing up at the polls. We have a way of doing that as long as it's responsive to what they want to see and get. And that's why I love so much what Mayor Tubbs said about just how you approached, even as an elected official, how you approach thinking about it, like, what problem did we create, and what's our obligation to make sure government's working for everyone, That sounds basic, but it's actually pretty revolutionary.
Oh, it's radical.
It's radical, and it's also possible.
That's
right.
right.
And when people can see that they have that path of possibility on the things that speak to their lives, that's when we have movement.
Mm-hmm. Mayor Tubbs?
I was so enamored with tap into the power, not the problem. So remind me the question again. Because I wrote that down. I was like, that's good. Because I think oftentimes we focus so much on the problem, but that becomes really, like, even spiritually demoralizing, particularly the moment we're in now, where it's like the world's on fire, reproductive rights are on fire, democracy's on fire. Like there's so many like really big existential fights happening, and very intense, and all at the same time that you think about. And I'm like a problem solver. It's like this problem, but I appreciate that reframe in terms of no, focus on the power, because you have agency there. And then that makes you better equipped to begin to solve these problems. But I'm sorry, Dr. Rojas, what was the question?
I kind of want to ask you both a different question that takes us back to something Maya said, and frankly, it's something that I have been in the swirl of, right? Which is imagining a multiracial democracy. And frankly, two things. Maya, you said we need to get more people that look like us and think like us into positions. But I feel like we are in a moment where the look like us is superseding the think like us at our expense and peril. And I know this is close to a common experience. That's what I will say. And I wonder two things. How do we grapple with that? And what is the space to grapple with that? And then secondly, something else you said, Maya, you should really be the moderator of this.
The questions would be easier if I was the moderator.
This is the thing that people who ask me to moderate never know, is that like I use it as my therapy. I'm like, I'm grappling with this thing, so I'm just gonna bring it to this conversation, and we're just gonna help Carmen figure some stuff out. But the second is the place of white people in our multiracial democracy and in our movement. And I feel like we have somehow done two things. We have said, we've seen sort of the rise of not progressive, not even liberal mayors of color, governors of color step into positions of power based on race at our community's peril. And on the other side, I feel like the invisibilizing of white people may be too strong of a statement, but the lack of placement for white people in the multiracial democracy and the capturing of them by right-wing white supremacist forces. And I'm wondering how you both are thinking about these two. Are these two things connected? So let me start with an easy thing. I'll start with Michael Tubbs. Mayor Tubbs, you shouldn't have asked me to ask this question again. But how do these two things come together? Do they come together for you? Is this the right assessment that I am making? And then two, what is a way forward?
Yeah, well, if it's not responsive, feel free to push back. But what ties all this, what you described, all the existential threats we're facing, is really sort of what Du Bois called the problem of the color line, or in simple folk language, like white supremacy, right? And white supremacy doesn't have a race. It's an idea and ideology around this hierarchy of human value, who's important and who's not. So, and it's easier to win an election in a country founded on white supremacy by espousing white supremacist ideas, and white supremacist ideas like locking people up, or white supremacist ideas about like the falsehoods of meritocracy, knowing that there's structural barriers. That's an easy sell. That's like that takes no creativity. You could go out now and get everyone to vote for you and say it's those people's fault, or we need more of this and we need more of that. So I think that's what we're seeing, is that people are taking advantage of a moment of such change and such crisis, where folks are looking for something that feels safe, that feels secure, that feels stable. And oftentimes, and I'm no psychologist, but I think at times like that, people may cling to a bias or a schema or ideology, regardless if it's true or not, because it feels familiar and it feels like home. Number one. And then number two, I think the only other plank I would add, and that's why I appreciate Maya so much. Like, I think even a moniker of progressive for me is becoming pejorative, because like, to be progressive is to be effective. Like to be progressive, you have to get stuff done. Like in a very imperfect and messy world. So I really struggle with sort of this progressive yardstick that isn't about effectiveness or making progress, but it's about sort of, did you endorse Bernie Sanders for president? That also, and I think that all falls under this line around sort of, we have to really deal with white supremacy and unlearn that, and really, and then the last part of your question about what the role of white folks in a multiracial democracy. And I'm not in office, so I probably won't be in as much trouble for saying this, but I think if you look at the insurrectionists, if you look at sort of the fascists, if you look at, those are white folks. So white folks really have to, if don't even own the multiracial democracy, own the democracy movement. We need white folks to be like, look, we believe strongly in democracy. And this democracy in 2020 is going to look way different than the democracy in 1776. But take hold of that, like, the documents your folks wrote matter, and there could be more alive today. So I really think sort of white, and I'm sure Maya's going to talk about this, but even if you look at the civil rights movement, some of the, not necessarily the leaders, but some of the real foot soldiers, some of the folks who died on the bus were white folks. I remember doing a free rights reenactment in college with real freedom riders. And I was amazed that of the 20 people with us, 5 of them were white folks. 5 of them were white folks, and 3 of them were like Jewish. Like, so there are 8 people who weren't Black who were showing me the scars from where they were beaten and showing me their, like, it was like such a reframe in terms of what I thought movement was. So I definitely think sort of for anyone who loves democracy or anyone who loves humanity, that like you have to be in this fight. I think white people, it's the same thing I say about government. Like, if you or your aunties, or if some part of the problem people in your network who are likely to listen to you have created, you have a responsibility to help solve it. And you might not get coddled all the time. You might not be greeted with a hero's welcome every time you show up to a particular space, but it's not about you or me anyway. It's about this collective and this thing we're trying to save that, again, is literally on fire because we really haven't dismantled the thinking around sort of white supremacy and the way it creates a hierarchy of human value.
Thank you, Mayor Tubbs. Maya?
Well, thank you for the question. And I want to, in adding on, say a couple of things I hope is, I believe deeply to be true, and I've seen it in the data, and think it's important for us all to recognize, is that the majority of this country does not agree with what we're seeing with the ugly, hateful attack on our democracy. And I think that's important to remember, because part of what has happened, both in what we see in media representation for perfectly legitimate reasons that I understand, right, which is big, horrible stuff happens. And if you go look at the underpinning, it's like these hateful people, actually not all white, although mostly white, but we should say not all white.
No, the head of the Proud Boys is an Afro-Latino. So like, there's
absolutely. And Proud Boys, as we know, is the gateway group to white supremacist organizations. I mean, it's literally a feeder, a direct feeder, and that's what its members represent. But the reason I say that is because it has been given such permission. And too often, even by powerful people, whether powerful because they're wealthy or powerful because they hold political office, it has been normalized and given permission. And what that's done is it's taken what really is a majority of the country, not because we agree on everything, not because there aren't tensions, not because there aren't real issues we've never solved, to Mayor Tubbs' point, and I would say we were still trying to solve, but it has actually served to swell the ranks. We have seen it growing. because it's been normalized. Because one of the victories of the civil rights movement wasn't that we ended racism or completely transformed the system of racial hierarchy. We didn't. We made some good strides, but we didn't just topple that whole rotten apple cart. But what we did do is take permission away. And that mattered, right? It mattered, and it helped us in the additional fights we had to try to dismantle a racist system, which, by the way, every time we made progress in that, helped some white folks. Helped some white folks. If you were a short white man, couldn't get on a police department because it discriminated against women with height requirements, guess what? You could now get a job in a police department, even if you were a short white man, because we took away. That was, you know, when we fought for public schools in this country that were not public because of racism and slavery, a whole bunch of white kids whose parents did not own land, who couldn't pay for a private education, suddenly got a free public one. You know, we forget all the ways in which this has advanced, you know, what again, Philip Randolph called a democratic community, which is that everyone's votes rise because we're taking care of everyone. But I say that because it also shows us how important it is to take that permission away. You know, which is exactly what I think Michael is talking about. I mean, Mayor Tubbs is talking about when, you know, you won your race. You know, that when we're talking about what it means to dismantle, right, including the cognitive framework that is. But I also want us to note just how important it is for us to recognize that fear is a powerful driver of division. And it's a powerful driver of division for white folks who otherwise do not consider themselves, you know, care about, we just did a polling, by the way, which is not public. So I'm breaking news here today. But it showed that a majority of this country, and we polled across race, and it was a national survey, and 1,000 folks sampled, said things like, you know, this country has to do better by people of color. Said things like, you know, our democracy is in trouble, and, you know, we actually need more voting. I mean, it said all these things that do not represent what we're hearing as the dominant narrative, because there are people in power who have actually decided that to ride the coattails, something they don't even agree with, because it helps them hold on to power. So ultimately, it always comes back to power and fighting fear with hope and possibility. And I don't mean that in a fuzzy sense. You know, I think, you know, what Mayor Tubbs represents is some very explicit things that government could do to make it better. It's part of why I got as far as I did in a campaign where we'd never elected a Black woman, and I was saying some stuff that everybody said would not win me an election, you know, and yet I rose to the top of a very, you know, top 3 of a very big field with these big radical ideas. And so I say that, and I had a lot of folks who are white who wanted to support that because they needed it. They needed it. And I'll just go back to one other thing. So when President Biden, you know, one of the victory laps he so rightly took was bringing childhood poverty down 40%.
That's right.
40% in 1 year. What does that tell us? Guess what? Poverty is a construct for everybody. And if you actually start to take away race as a wedge that says that we shouldn't have government funding things like childcare, putting money in people's pockets so they can pay the rent, that once you take that off the table, actually everybody's votes rise, and that it works, And so I just want to say, like, pointing to things like that is part of our way out. And it doesn't say to white folks, and part of our messaging really proves this, but it's what I've always believed. And I come from an interracial family. I come from a white mother who was like, we just wrong in this country and we got to change it, right? And so we have those allies who still will say those things. But the point is that we have to keep talking about, we're stronger together, but we won't get there together if we don't recognize the role that race is playing and holding us all back. And if we let women be kidnapped and raped on Native American reservations, if we let middle-class white women not be able to figure out a place to afford to put their kids in childcare. If we let Black folks rot in a criminal justice system that makes no sense because they didn't do anything that should rot them in that system. That if we do those things, we will have better schools. We will have more nutrition. We will have more access to healthcare. We will have the ability to take care of our kids and our families, and it will be across race, but only if we take account of race.
Yeah.
And so I say that because I think we have some proof points to that. And the issue is about power and building.
Yeah. I do. The theme for me in this conversation, or what one of the things that I keep coming back to, is this choice points, right? Like that people in power are making a set of choices that impact our day-to-day lives, and that you two in each of your positions across your careers have either been witnessing, influencing, shaping, informing the set of choice points, shining a light on the set of choice points, who is making the choices, how those choices are made. And I think oftentimes, or the thing about this moment that feels very difficult, is that we can't, the people making decisions feel like a scary person in a closet that's not visible to us. And I love that in this conversation, these people are more visible. They have more texture. They are humans who are benefiting from the pain, from the hurt, and from the poverty. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm gonna actually just ask you all a short question. Throughout this conversation, there's a balance of the state of our nation and the dream of our democracy, right? And right now, those two things feel very far away. And I'm wondering for each of you, what is bringing you joy in your work? What is the thing that is lighting you up on the inside, giving you a bubble of oxygen, making it helpful for you to wake up and continue to fight for the future that we know is possible? I'll start with you, Mayor Tubbs.
Of course. 3 or 4 things. I alluded to it earlier in the first answer, but I have a 3-year-old son and a 1-year-old daughter. And I really do believe my daughter's gonna be president. And you can ask anyone from the time she was
Manifest.
I was like, she's
Manifest. All you have to do is say it out loud.
But my wife's gonna be like, oh my gosh, who does anyway? But no, I say that because I watch them develop and grow and just see how happy they are and how kind they are and how divine they are. And I think about sort of the world that we're in and how despite that, they're still happy and still growing, still playing with trucks and still want to cuddle. And I think for me, it's taking solace in the fact that they trust that me and daddy and mommy's friends are going to do something. Like they're not worried about anything at all because they trust that we're going to be good ancestors. That will be inevitable, but we're going to do something. So that gives me joy because I'm like, they have more time statistically in this country, and they're not stressed and angry, playing. They're like really playing outside right now. So that brings me a lot of solace and hope. Number 2, and it speaks to something you said earlier, Maya, about sort of the family you come from. And I've been very blessed to be mentored by Marion Wright Elderman from the Children's Defense Fund. And I remember when I was first on city council and Tamir Rice was murdered. And it's like, I was just like, I'm tired. Like, what's happening? Like, nothing's changing. And she looked at me and she said, do you understand that it's a privilege to struggle for justice? Like, it's a privilege to be in she called it the Hall of Saints. Like, it's a privilege in the lineage of those who fought in different circumstances, oftentimes more difficult circumstances with less opportunity because they saw you. And she just broke it down just in terms of her career, from the Poor People's Campaign to Head Start to Children's Defense Fund and the wins and the losses and and she was like, and it's been a privilege to do that. And so that gives me a lot of hope as well. It's like, wow, actually the work is difficult, but it's such a great opportunity and such a blessing to be called to be for the next generation, what the ancestors I look up to were for me. And then the last thing I think that gives me hope in this moment is just sort of just being raised by 3 church ladies well, really one church lady and two of her kids, my grandma, her two daughters, who really instilled a deep sense of faith in me and this idea that weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning, or this idea of don't get weary in well-doing, for in due season you'll reap a harvest if you don't faint, or this idea that God is a God of justice, or a God who cares about the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the like. Those things also give me a lot of hope, because there's so many like stories and real life examples of like when times were bleak, and then a couple folks, not everyone, but a couple folks got together and said, you know what, it has to be better than this. And we don't know what we're going to do is going to work, but we got to work it. And I think those are the things that keep me going, because if someone had quit or this, I think pessimism is such a luxury, and only people with privilege can be pessimistic, because if you're really a young woman in the South who can't afford to fly to get an abortion, you have to have hope for something better. Like if you're like really an undocumented person in these states that can't get access to any government benefits or help, like there, some folks, like, to be pessimistic is akin to death. So this idea of hope is like, no, it has to be better. And I think I also take solace from folks like that.
Thank you so much, Mayor Tubbs. Maya, you close us out.
Woo. Well, and I think this is, so I've got a 21-year-old and an 18-year-old, so I'll just say they point out all the failures that you've ever made in the world. So enjoy 1 and 3 while you can, because I'm getting why you ain't fixed this. Why we got to fix it. But I actually find tremendous joy in my fierce and fabulous 2 daughters. But I do think, so and I mean this, I think this generation coming up is a powerful one, committed one, it's an activist one. And obviously, like all generations, not every single individual, but I think I just see so much vision and leadership and drive that's actually for the rest of us who start getting tired and flagging and maybe letting our sights drop a little bit in what's possible. It reminds us to lift our gaze right back up again. And the other's people. Some of my most joyful experiences, whether it's at work with some of my tremendous colleagues, with some of our partners, but also just being in community. People are amazing. If we remember that, so much of how we have a conversation in this country is not really sitting down with people, right? It's listening to the news or seeing a hearing or, being in a meeting. And that can be very soul killing, because we forget our humanity, but we also forget the humanity of others. And I'll tell one quick story that was just from this last week, actually, but at the White House Summit on Hate and Bias. But there were a lot of directly impacted people in the summit, and also, I mean, people who had lost an eye because of a hate crime, or who are afraid to walk down the street without another person with them because of a hate crime, who had lost a son. But there was also a young man, young to me, who was white, who had been a white supremacist. He had been recruited in, and he got out, and he spent the past 10 years doing 2 things that he talked about being necessary to move forward. And one was redemption, which is a value I hold dear, and I think is necessary for society to hold. But the other is accountability. But what he said is, there is no redemption without accountability. And he said, I have to account every day for what I did when I was doing hateful things. And I thought, what humanity. What humanity, and the opportunity to be with people and in their resilience. And I think it's just as Mayor Tubbs said, is we are allowed to be tired. We are, because it's tiring and it's hard work. We're just not allowed to stop, because nobody before us did. And I think about that period in history, and we talk about the first Reconstruction, which was the end of slavery, and the second Reconstruction, which was the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. We never talk about that 100 years in between. There were people who were born and died in that 100 years. between. And in those 100 years, guess what they were doing?
Fighting.
They were fighting.
That's right.
Just because they don't get a page in the history books, just because I don't think I'll get a page in the history books, that's not my success metric. But whether the people I'm with are leaning into redemption and accountability and humanity is going to keep me going.
On that note, I just want to thank you both for the time today. That is all of the time that we have. I am so grateful and full, especially from this last part of our conversation. I think in these moments, having sort of lanterns, buoys, lighthouses that help remind us of the redemption and accountability, Maya, and of like the greatness of being a good ancestor, Michael. Like I am, what a gift to go into the rest of this day with. I want to thank folks at 92nd Street Y for hosting this conversation, and to folks in the audience, I'm glad that you've been able to join. And please be sure to scan the QR code on the screen to take a brief poll. Let us know what you think, and let us know what you learned. And with that, I want to say thank you and have a great day.
Hello, my name is Rebecca Shrestlet, and I'm Managing Director of the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact at the 92nd Street Y, New York. We hope you're enjoying the State of America Summit. The next panel, How We Accelerate Democracy, celebrates the innovators, investors, and big ideas dedicated to solving our country's biggest challenges. It is that same spirit that inspired the new Belfer Center initiative, Share Our America, that combats polarization across the United States. Share Our America's inaugural pilot, jointly run by the Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact at 92NY and the Episcopal Diocese of Nebraska, brought together participants representing a spectrum of political perspectives, religious traditions, and lived experiences. Over 4 days, participants got to know each other through facilitated conversations about their differences, social activities, shared meals, a homestay, a visit to a local ranch, and all the moments in between. Here's a short video to bring you highlights from our first trip to Chadron, Nebraska. Following this video, our esteemed panel for How to Accelerate Democracy will begin. We are currently expanding Share Our America to communities across the country. For more information and how you can get involved, please visit shareouramerica.org or click the link in the chat.
Some of the problems that we have in the United States, we don't understand each other.
We created a container that forced people to listen. And only once everyone has had a chance to share their perspective do you then engage in sort of cross-dialogue of asking questions, all designed to understand rather than to persuade.
I saw people coming out of their shells, and myself as well.
By the end of the first day, people were already crying and opening up so vulnerably with each other.
Listening skills are so important.
There were things that I didn't agree with, but it was more like, this person feels this way. And I still like them, even though that opinion or that belief is a little weird for me.
Share America is not about changing anyone's mind, and it's not about finding common ground. The goal is to say, I now see you as a human, even though you see things differently than I do.
Hello, and welcome to the State of America Summit exploring new ideas in civic life. This conversation is entitled How We Accelerate Democracy and is brought to you by the 92nd Street Y and its pro-democracy initiative from the Newmark Civic Life series. My name is Andrew Richey, and I'm the founder of Civic Hall in New York, and I'm honored to be guiding today's conversation with an esteemed panel of innovators and investors who are reimagining the next 250 years of our democracy. With us today, we have Jessica Salinas, the Chief Investment Officer of New Media Ventures, Alex Nimchevsky, CEO and founder of Ballot Ready, Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus and a Director of the Center for Campaign Innovation, and Henry Elkis, Founder and CEO of Helena, America in One Room. And we're going to get started right away with giving everybody a chance to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Andrew. And hi, everyone. Really excited to be on this panel with you. Like Andrew said, I'm Jessica Salinas, and I am the Chief Investment Officer at New Media Ventures. We're an early stage seed fund that invests in activists and entrepreneurs that are innovating to advance the progressive movement. We have 3 verticals that we fund, and that's advocacy and organizing. We have media and narrative, and we have elections and engagement, or civic tech. And the reason I'm really excited to have this conversation is because I believe one of the most important pillars to advance the progressive movement is functioning democracy. And democracy, for me, can only function if every person affected by its laws and its systems has the ability to participate meaningfully. And to do that, and this to a point that you made, Andrew, we have to make civic engagement, which includes electoral participation. We have to make it accessible and relevant to its population. And that means access to accurate information. It means building avenues for people to engage quickly and effectively with their government and public services. It means meeting people where they're at, regardless of the zip code, their education level, their income, et cetera. And it also means doing it at scale. And I think that's where NMV has played and plays a key role. We've invested early in these founders like Ballot Ready, so hi Alex, who are creating the innovations or who are leveraging innovations to build political power for all communities, especially those who historically, for a multitude of reasons, have not had it. Because if we're only allowing a segment of folks, for example, by putting petty and heavy restrictions on voting or running for office, or by making voting physically inaccessible, or by hindering our ability to access truthful and trustworthy information, if we're only allowing a segment of those folks to participate, and thus dictate the direction of our laws, our policies, and our systems, then are we truly a democracy? And I don't think that we are. And so that's why I think these conversations are important, and why I'm excited to be here to dig into it further. So excited to hear from everybody else.
That was fast. Thank you, Jessica. Alex.
Yeah, so hi, everyone. I'm Alex Nimchevsky, the CEO and co-founder of Ballot Ready. And I started Ballot Ready about almost 8 years ago, and I was getting ready to vote, but I saw my ballot ahead of time, and I realized I knew who to vote for at the top of the ballot, but there were all these other offices like Water Reclamation Commissioner that I had never even heard of, didn't know what they were responsible for, and all the candidates running, I had never heard of them before. So I wanted to prepare myself. So I made a website just for myself. And then when I talked to other people, like everyone I talked to was like, yeah, I don't know who to vote for further down the ballot. And this included like political science professors and even a certain mayor of a certain very large city who was like, I don't know which judges to vote for. So when we started, we were tackling this issue of people not feeling informed when it comes to more local stuff on their ballot. But we now know, like, many voters don't even know there are elections beyond the presidential election. And we see that a lot in local election turnout is super low. Sometimes in some cities, it's like 10%. In New York, it was only 25%. That's like kind of insane for democracy in the United States. So what we do is we try to make it really easy for voters to find information about who they're going to vote for, about how to vote, especially with COVID and changing rules. Things like voting by mail are, it's actually pretty easy to do, but people are very unfamiliar with the process. So we try to make it super easy. We also show people information about how to run for office. Our whole goal is making information accessible, both and user-friendly, to make it easier for people everywhere to participate in democracy. And our goal is we want everyone to vote confidently all the way down their ballot in every election forever. So that's what we do and why I'm excited about this conversation today.
Thank you, Alex. Eric.
Hi there, I'm Eric Wilson. I'm the managing partner of Startup Caucus. We're the home of technological innovation on the right. We invest and incubate in companies that help Republicans win. And one of the reasons that our work is so important is we believe that it's essential to have both parties on parity in terms of technological capabilities, so our campaigns can be about ideas and candidates rather than the tactics and methods. And there's also a clear need for campaign tools that transform the interactions into conversations instead of one-way monologues. I think one of the reasons investment in technology around democracy is so important is because we do have a two-party system, and having a robust competitive party, whether that's a Republican Party or a Democratic Party, serves our democracy well. And we started to notice that Republicans were slipping behind in their ability to access campaign technology. We're trying to level that playing field. Eager to share more about our insights on this conversation going forward.
Great. And Henry, please.
Hey, everybody. My name is Henry Alkas. I'm the founder and CEO of an organization called Helena. The purpose is to identify solutions to critical societal problems that could have real global scale. Step 2, conduct due diligence on them to figure out whether they should be actually implemented. And then critically, step 3, do our absolute best to implement them. And the way we do that has multiple prongs. We actually have a for-profit that sits next to a nonprofit and legislative arm, so that we can actually be agnostic about, during the diligence period, whether the best way to implement a given solution is through building it through capital markets, whether it shouldn't make money and therefore should sit in a 501c3 structure, or whether the best way to solve a problem is through legislation. So just to give a couple examples of work that we've done in the past, on the for-profit side, we now have a couple $100 million in management right now and growing. We've invested and built companies in the alternative to plastic space, alternative to styrofoam space. In the climate area, we've done work in grid scale energy storage to replace lithium ion and rare earth mineral sources to transition the world away from fossil fuels into clean energy, invest in things like nuclear fusion, and also our artificial intelligence implementations for the reversal of chronic disease, type 2 diabetes, things like that. On the nonprofit side, we've done a different sweep of work, thinking about helping build the future of cities. We're working on a project called Oceanics that is building the world's first modular floating city. We did a major response to COVID where we bought and transferred 37 million units of PPE to hospitals that most needed them and helped the US government build an autonomous platform to do all of the necessary logistical trading there. And on the legislative side, have worked so far mostly on existential risk issues. One example of this being identifying a very bipartisan problem, which is the vulnerability of the North American electrical grid, all the ways they can go down and all the common sense solutions to address it. So in that case, I was writing and passing legislation in a project called SHIELD. One of the projects within our portfolio is called America in One Room. And we've now done multiple of these. What we did was, with our partners at Stanford and Helena members that have worked with us, brought together the most representative sample of the United States or any country ever, bought out the largest hotel in Texas for 3 straight days and flew this sample to actually live with each other for that time. And with the help of presidential candidates that physically came and beamed in, we conducted over 3 straight days a deliberative democracy exercise in which the top 5 issues that were at stake in the 2020 election were discussed face-to-face with no technology ad nauseum with this group. And we were able to measure the delta, the starting value of what people polled coming into the event, and then the change that occurred over those 3 days. And it was radical on both sides, up to 40 to 50% changes, both on the Republican and the Democratic side, and massive increase in desirability to continue working within a democratic system amongst the entire populace. So I come to this conversation not as a political organization, but actually as an organization trying to work at a global scale, agnostic to a solution from one party or another, and just trying to find solutions to problems of global nature. And got into this space just because I thought we had an opportunity to do something that was really critical of import, and the numbers simply worked out to do it. So excited to share the project and some of the other work we're doing with these great panelists.
Thank you, Henry. I saw a recent poll that surprised me, which stated that the number one issue facing Americans claim they're facing isn't inflation. It's actually the strength of our democracy. And it was on both sides, both Republican and Democratic sides, both stated that. And I'm just curious, if we're going to talk about some solutions, maybe we should talk a little bit about why that's the problem. And I think that one of the challenges we have is that technology is playing a major role in how people are receiving information, how they're sharing information, and how campaigns, and Eric, you mentioned what you're doing on the Republican side, how campaigns are trying to communicate with their particular base. But Jessica, I'm going to start with you. If you could tell me what you think is the fundamental problem that's caused this rise in people's fear that our democracy is in peril.
Oh, I think there are so many contributing factors to that. I think there is a loss of trust, absolutely, in the government, and that they are not acting in the best interests of the majority, which is what a democracy should do, right, by definition. I think there's also, the rise of mis and disinformation. And I think a part of that is because our government, our politics, to something Eric mentioned, our campaigns are not innovating as quickly as the creators, the technologists, the people that are consuming it. The way that we interact, the way that we are influenced, that we learn and that we communicate are continuously evolving, and they're evolving at a really rapid pace with the advancement of technologies and the continuous development of new tools. And our political system falls behind often, and they do it poorly. And and there's so many reasons to that. I think there's procurement process in the gov tech level, and I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with them, that just take forever and are very tenuous and detailed, et cetera, because the people that are serving us are not inclusive or reflective of the people who are building and consuming. We know, for example, a few years ago, YouTube was one of the major ways that people consumed, was one of the top search bars, right? Not Google, but YouTube. Well, YouTube is part of Google, but YouTube, which is video. And these were long form videos. Now people are consuming more quickly through TikTok, right? And those are shorter videos. And the amount of time that the younger generations are spending on platforms like TikTok and Be Real, et cetera, are extensive, right? And we as older generations and the people in office are not catching up to those behaviors and the way people are changing and the trends, et cetera. And so I think that's a big gap that exists, and that's contributing to the feeling of our democracy not feeling trustworthy, not feeling like it is as sturdy as it might have been before. And so that's just a quick thought, so I can allow my other panelists to jump in and either agree, disagree, or offer their perspectives.
Alex or Eric?
Well, I think I take a little bit more optimistic view here because, one, you always have to look at sort of, well, what is the alternative? This is the system that we've got. Could it work better? Does it need some updating? Absolutely. But there's not a clear alternative that is somehow better that we're just overlooking. I think we're in this very important transitional stage. I sometimes think of it as the largest migration event in human history from offline to online. We're living through that right now. where online life is offline life. And that's causing disruptions to institutions, authorities, removing gatekeepers, all of the things that are causing this disruption. Some people are having an easier time making that transition than others. I'm confident that once we get to the other side of that, we'll be in a much better place to understand what our shared values are, get back on track. And I think it's important to consider innovations that might update the operating system of our republic and our democracy along the way. But we've got a good system in place. In some ways, it's operating as intended, slowing us down, making sure that there's consensus.
But Eric, if you don't mind me challenging you a little bit, to some degree, technology is being used by the parties to game the system in order to take advantage of its structural problems. And so, massive data sets, targeting of voters, and now with technology, Jessica just mentioned TikTok, but, the way in which people can manipulate video and imaging, and the fact that we don't actually educate our public about how to interpret the information that they're being fed. Those activities are all being used by the parties or the candidates to ensure that they win when election day comes along. There's a difference between making sure that our democracy is fair and winning. So how do you square that?
So I think I'd offer two considerations here. One is, if you go back and look at when TV first started coming into congressional hearing rooms, it was awkward. People didn't know how to do it. There is a learning process that's going on. It is messy. We're trying to figure out what are the boundaries, what is right, what is good, what is best. Pick your adjective. So again, maintain patience. We're working through some transitions on both sides, I'll say. And then second, again, thinking back to this as a human migration event, you think about what happened when we went from being in sort of tribal communities to cities. There's this huge influx of diseases. Steam power started bringing diseases from other places around the world. We need to understand digital hygiene, understand how to spot this disinformation, misinformation, and build out education around that. Again, it's going to take time. It surprised us quickly, and it's going to take us some time to recalibrate. I think that doesn't mean we shouldn't be optimistic.
So, Alex, could you talk a little bit about how your organization might use technology to make sure that the voters can actually see the entire roster of candidates that they're responsible to be voting for?
Yeah. So one of the things we do is, we know voters are more aware of like the presidential candidates or the candidates running for Senate. And there's a lot in the news about those races and those candidates. But voters are aware that their vote has a lot more power at the local level, and that local elected officials may make more decisions that affect their daily lives. So big thing we do is we say, hey, look, these are all the local offices that are going to be on your ballot. Here are the candidates running. Here's background information about them. We always link to the sources, and often like candidate stances we put in the candidate's own words. We don't editorialize. We do that so that voters can feel confident about the votes they're casting, especially at the local level. And part of why we think that's so important, beyond just increasing turnout and increasing informed votes, is because we believe that if people have more faith in local elections, that will trickle up. They may have more faith in national, presidential elections as well.
Henry, you mentioned bringing everybody together physically in Texas for 3 days. And I have a theory that people's desire to be heard is actually greater than their desire to be right. And so the opportunity of bringing people together to just actually listen and validate each other's opinions may be even more important than getting them to fight for their candidate alone. And I'm just curious whether or not you've tried to implement any of your mixing of opinions using technology, not just bringing people together physically.
Yes, we absolutely have. And I'll talk about that in 1 second. I just wanted to chime in on the question you asked before, because I think it's actually essential in answering that question. We have a big global technology problem, full stop, and politics is a subset of it. And I want to explain, I think, my view on this and how this interfaces with it. There was a really great quote from a guy named E.O. Wilson, a biologist, who was asked, what is the problem statement of humanity? And he was able to concretize kind of the last 20 minutes in one sentence, which was, we have Paleolithic brains that haven't changed since the beginning of humanity. We have medieval institutions, yet we develop godlike technology. And so the rate of development of technology is asymptotic, while the response to that technology from the public sector to make sense of it is linear. And that is only getting worse. And it's not getting worse in a kind of arithmetic way. It's getting worse in an exponential way. So Eric, the only way where I would respectfully disagree with you when using historical analogies like the advent of television and putting that into congressional hearings is that our view is that this was an implementation of technology during an era of human history where we could still wait for technology to be implemented and then react to it. Just like we were, for example, able to narrowly escape the results of the Manhattan Project, the creation of a technology that could destroy all of humanity. And then we had to rejigger all of geopolitical civilization in order to make sense of it. And we barely made ourselves out of that space. I think we've crossed a Rubicon in which, when you look at technologies like TikTok, they start engaging the limbic system, the limbic brain, and the kind of the rat brain, and start attacking people from an emotional standpoint before logic can kick in. And so what we need to do, in my view, is realize that we can no longer be a reactive democracy and a reactive governance system. And we need to start being proactive to understand which types of technologies are going to be hitting in the next 5 to 6 years, and how we can write legislation now or change democracy now to respond to it when that happens. To answer your question directly, Andrew, as far as how we're trying to use technology in this space, part of the answer is by not using technology. And so when you bring people together face to face, what you don't have is a $1 trillion company using an algorithm made by floors of PhDs, way smarter than a human being, to manipulate that human being. You're able to return humanity back to the analog structure of talking face to face and start to see the results of that. And the way that we can use technology is actually to better broadcast those results, to better get the data that results from deliberative polling to the media and to candidates to demonstrate if they're going to run for office and be representative of the constituency. And we've polled that constituency, and that constituency disagrees with a plank of the candidate, that they have to respond to that data specifically. And so when we think about the use of technology, it's actually more what happens after the event rather than the event itself. And the only exception is when we try to scale this operation up and do this with hundreds of thousands of people rather than 500 people. And we're still very skeptical of the use of technology in those spaces. I think the area that we've seen a lot of benefit from artificial intelligence is through moderators, to have automated moderators. So you can actually have modular scale where you have 1,000 groups of 30 people all simultaneously discussing immigration at once, as opposed to one group of 300,000 people with one human being kind of hitting everything. So I know I hit a bunch of topics there, but those are my 2 cents on the tech element of this.
So let's talk about democracy for a second as a myth, because we have gerrymandered districts. We vote on Tuesday once a year, technically, for a national election and some local elections. There's too much money in politics. And Henry, you just mentioned the speed of technology. Technology companies are doing everything they can and spending as much as they possibly can to make sure that the legislation isn't written in a way that will prevent them from continuing to make massive amounts of money. And talking about money, we have way too much money in politics, which is influencing our system. So what are we trying to preserve, or what are we trying to save? Should we be trying to save a system that doesn't actually exist in fairness, or should we be thinking about new modes of governance that go beyond democracy of the 20th century and look to ways of governing in the 21st or the 22nd?
Well, Andrew, I'll stipulate to the first point. I think I would say that the issue of money in politics is not too much. I'd like to hear what the right amount of money in politics should be, in your opinion. the fact is we spend more money on Halloween candy every year than we do our democracy. So I think it's worth investing in.
Alex, you're smiling.
I also was going to contend with one thing you said to say there are actually elections almost every week of the year. So there are many more elections than people.
Yes, of course. But most people think of elections as election day. And instead of expanding election day as maybe over, both parties are fighting this battle over either contracting the amount of time people can vote or expanding the amount of time or how they can vote. And it all seems like to be part of the same game, which is to, limit or control the process of which people can voice their opinion. And it's just one part of the system that doesn't function properly. And I'm just asking a broader question, which is, should we really be, at the same time that we're trying to fix the structural problems that exist in our current democracy, should we be experimenting with new ways of governing, proxy voting, for example? I
can throw one thing in here, Andrew. I think while I think it's a worthwhile exercise on a think tank level to think about entirely new forms of governance, I think the way that I would interact with the question you asked is actually by saying the point of democracy is to constantly update it. It has to be a malleable structure. And this is not talking about the elasticity versus the inelasticity of the Constitution to say this. This is something that I think both sides agree with. So when we think, for example, about term limits, when we think about the incentive structure of running for office every 2 years, should we reinterrogate that? When we think about the manner in which Congress takes a summer off, and the fact that was written in the 17th century, the 18th century, how should that be updated? So there are structural things I think about democracy, ranked choice voting, et cetera, that have unfortunately in a lot of ways had partisan connotations to them, but in my view shouldn't and should be viewed much more objectively. Then when we talk about, I think, the engagement between constituencies and their representatives, there's so much clay to mold here that is actually a healthy place, I think, with the right legislative framework for these large tech companies to lean in on. And there are companies, I think, like Snapchat that have done a decent job in kind of the early innings of this. But there's so much integration that can occur between the private sector and the public sector in governance. The issue is, if you think about during the LBJ era, people grew up and they went to the top schools in the United States, and what they dreamed of was not to go work in the private equity or the hedge fund industry. They dreamed about being senators. And so we have a brain drain that goes away from just the raw talent into the public square and towards private industry, in part for cultural reasons, but also in part for economic reasons, because that share of talent can be trapped and brought into the business sector much more easily.
Well, it's been said many times that for the democracy to work, the electorate has to be informed, and you're obviously all working on that. But you could also argue, and I think quite successfully, that both parties have premeditatedly underfunded public education for decades in order to keep the population from being able to actually engage fully and hold them accountable. So where's the role of public funding for civic education fall into this category? Because you could ask any politician, and every politician will say they support public education, and every politician will say that they want to see more civics taught in public schools. But when it comes to the actual votes when they vote on the budget, that money's not, they don't put that money in. So we have a problem. We have a big structural problem right at the foundation of our society. We don't teach empathy. We don't teach civics. And so we're expecting our democracy to get fixed at the top, but we're not actually working at the bottom as much as you are, like you're trying to do. Eric, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, campaigns in a lot of ways are reflections of the voters, right? So I think you've zeroed in on this voter education piece. Henry mentioned ranked choice voting, which is something I'm very supportive of. I think it's one of those upgrades to our operating system as a republic that's really important. And one of the things that we found is that when you ask voters, we've done some polling on this, when you ask voters, particularly when you've got multiple candidates, they end up learning about all of the other candidates, right? When you ask them to rank every candidate in a race. They go out and learn about them. So that the changing the game mechanics, if you will, can incentivize or direct that learning. I think it is tough. We do have a huge gap in civic education. A lot of people don't understand why we have the system that we have, and nor do they appreciate the benefits of that system that we have. So it is a challenge. I think it's hard to ascribe one thing there, but if we can update some of the frameworks for how people participate in the democracy, I think we'll get better results that way.
Jessica?
Yeah, Andrew, I was going to say, I actually, going back to your previous question, I tend to agree with you, which is a little different than other viewpoints here. I think that democracy as it has functioned here in the United States has failed a majority of underserved populations that look like me, right, that are Latinos, the Black population, Indigenous population, the incarcerated population, et cetera, poor people, or rural people, and I think that there is value in investing in the problems that democracy is facing right now. And we do at NMB, right? We invest in trying to strengthen the current system to make it better for people, because in reality, it's the system we're living under. However, I think for me, it would be, if we're investing in innovations, I think we have to be future forward, right? And future forward means reimagining systems, right? The system that works right now may not be the system that works for people in 30 to 40 years. And if we're going to be, for me, a good investor, a good leader, then I have to be looking beyond what exists today. And that, again, might mean new structures. It might mean new governance models. And I think that's also probably one of the most optimistic things that we can be investing in, right? A future that we don't even know exists yet, and systems that can be even better for people. So for me, we invest in democracy, but we also invest beyond democracy, because that's what our mandate is as investors in innovation. So I think that's how I feel about your previous question.
Alex, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I definitely think it would benefit us all if there was more civic education, but I also see a lot of, for adults, shame around they feel like they don't know enough, and they don't want to start conversations. They don't want to ask questions. And while we're here, in the short term, if there's anything we can do to just make people feel not ashamed if they don't know, but and have more open conversations like what Henry's doing, I think that could increase knowledge for more people faster.
Andrew, I'd like to make a defense of the system insofar as there are mechanisms to change and update our federal constitution, our state constitutions. We have ballot referenda. We have all sorts of mechanisms, and people are doing that all over the place. I think the benefit of the way that was structured is that it ensured that there was consensus on what the next update would be. And we're in a period of time right now where it's very difficult to find consensus, and so the default is not updating.
Or made worse. Or made worse. I mean, when you say people are trying to fix it or do things to make it more equitable, when you take a look at gerrymandering, and for example, what's happening in Ohio, they're also setting it up so it can only be fixed one way, their way.
Right, but you also have other states that are doing these independent redistricting commissions that are looking at computer simulations to determine what's fair. You've got states implementing ranked choice voting. I mean, the list goes on and on of people trying to make these changes and putting them forward. And to say that the changes are not going fast enough or not going the way we want is to neglect how the system is set up.
Yeah, I would argue that most of the places where you're seeing ranked choice voting or attempts to try to make the system more equitable, more fair, tend to be progressive parts of the country as opposed to conservative parts of the country. But instead of turning this into a political discussion, I'm going to switch a little bit and use moderator's prerogative to mention what Civic Hall is trying to do, which relates a little bit to technology, which is that as we're building our new facility in New York, which will be the largest digital skills training center focused on underrepresented populations in the country, we believe that unless the people around the table designing the future is as diverse as possible, we'll end up only designing the future to make it look the same as it is today if everybody around the table is white. And so when you're thinking about the future of democracy, and you're thinking about the future of technology, you can't separate the issue of diversity and equity from that equation. It's essential, actually. You can talk about technology advancing democracy, but unless the design of that democracy is built in an equitable and diverse way, we're going to repeat the same problems we have today. And so I'm just curious whether or not in any of your work, where do you see efforts that you think are promising to diversify the design of the future, to diversify the future of democracy, whether it's through technology or through any of these initiatives that you've already talked about? Where is the front line on leveling the playing field so that underrepresented populations have a fair chance at participation?
I'll just take one. There's no silver bullet to this. There's a silver buckshot, and there's a lot of pellets to it. I think the first one is for structural reasons, but also for technological reasons. Not just underserved minority communities, but as was mentioned previously in this panel, rural areas, which make up such a large percentage of our electorate, have oftentimes just not been accessible for constituents to even get their point of view across to their representatives, period. And so one of the really low-hanging fruit frontline stuff, kind of efforts that is underway in the technological community is internet access. It is non-premium, kind of free communication systems to simply get data to from constituents to representatives about what they would like them to vote for. And we saw this, I think, accelerate as one of the kind of rare positive outcomes from COVID is a kind of forced community of Zoom calls as opposed to in-person town halls. But we have to step on the gas pedal a bit harder there, just to even get the underlying data to then make decisions about how to have a more representative democracy. I think this goes just back to I think one of the worst buzzwords that's thrown around is systemic. How do we solve systemic problems? I think this topic is one of the rare instances in which we can actually kind of with clear eyes say that this is a systemic issue, because this is the lack of coordination in democracy is the issue that prevents us from solving every other issue. If we can't have human beings effectively communicate with one another about issues, then they simply can't solve them. And so the basic kind of building blocks of just getting access to human beings to even have those convenings is, I think, unfortunately, a problem that's not yet fully solved in America, even though the tech stack exists to do it.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, if I could, that the challenge isn't on the digital divide side isn't just connectivity. It's actually the skills necessary to be able to use the technology and to make your voice heard. So it's we might be able to connect everybody to broadband, and we might even be able to give everybody a computer, but their ability to use it is always being eclipsed by those who have more money or more resources. And that's a real challenge. And then there's also a generational issue, which is you look at the average age of a senator in this country. I used to have this line, I can't believe I still use it. It says, it goes, politicians don't know the difference between a server and a waiter. And that still brings a smile to people's faces because it's actually true. There are some elected officials who now get technology. People like Donald Trump have used Twitter in ways that are, eclipsed what many people had hoped for when it first came on the scene. But the amount of the age difference, the generational difference that exists in our democracy is a threat in itself, because as Henry, as you pointed out earlier, technology is advancing so exponentially that even the five of us can't keep up. So I'm just, as we wind down this panel, I'd love for you each to mention one or two initiatives that you know of that you've either supported or you started that you think is really at the front lines of building a more optimistic viewpoint on democracy, as opposed to us arguing about the political wins of today. I'm going to start with you, Jessica.
Yeah, I think my call to action is actually related to your question around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Henry, I agree with everything that you said. And we're investing in a lot of organizations and portfolio companies and company startups that are working to address those issues you called out. And I would add that one of the things that I think NMV has done well is in regards to funder education, so educating other funders. And one of the most important pillars of structural change is also changing who we're investing in, right? If we're only investing in homogenous groups that are building solutions, then they will only be building solutions to the problems that they are in proximate to or have a connection to. Therefore, we invest in people who have been most impacted, right? And I think that's most reflective in our investments from the past 2 years, where 12 out of the 16 investments are from people of color, right? They're building these technological solutions and these organizations that are looking to build that future, looking to strengthen democracy, that are looking to make connection and build a more just society for everybody. And I think that's what brings me optimism, and that's what gives me hope, and that's my call to action to other funders and other people in this space, is invest in the people that are closest to the problem.
And for the audience, if they're interested in knowing about some of these organizations, they could obviously go to your website. You'll probably have information about them and those investments, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, Alex?
Yeah, okay, so I have two. One is in 2020, 80% of the offices on the ballot across the country were uncontested. So only one candidate was running. So one of the things we do is make it easy to figure out what offices you can run for, what the salary is, when the filing deadlines are. That's more for elections next year. So that's the first thing. The second is the midterms are, depending on your viewpoint, maybe the beginning of the end of democracy. So I hope everyone gets informed about them and learns about the candidates on their ballot, which they can do at ballotready.org.
Thank you. Eric?
I think one of the most important things we can continue doing is making sure that other viewpoints, countering viewpoints, uncomfortable viewpoints continue to have a space to be heard. You don't have to agree with them, but shouting them down, excluding them from the public square is not the answer either. I think the several things have been mentioned in this panel today that are sort of just taken for granted as orthodoxy, when a lot of Americans would contest that. And so I think it's critical that we continue in investing and providing communities where people feel like they're able to express contrarian viewpoints. And that's the best way forward, in my opinion. If we just shut down debate and go in one direction, we'll miss out on some of the solutions that Henry's talking about.
And Henry, we're going to let you give us an optimistic point of view, because it seems like you're from what you described, you're already at the front lines in this conversation. I'd love to hear where you think some of us who are listening should go look and learn more.
Yeah, the optimistic point is that there is no kind of barrier to solving democratic issues. These are human problems. Like JFK's famous quote is, "No problems caused by humans can be solved by humans." So this is kind of a embarrassing problem that humanity has, rather than an impressive problem, in my view. I'll throw my vote into obviously something that I'm incentivized to say, which is deliberative polling, but specifically citizens' assemblies. So countries like Mongolia have now actually ingrained this into their constitution. we need an advisory council for the American people that isn't watching C-SPAN and watching Congress people debate. We need to have a representative sample of the American people that is constantly refreshed, that both the DNC and the RNC agree is a representative sample. And we need to have discussions not on candidates, but on issues. And what we found with American One Room, which is I think the first version of that at scale, and hopefully we did the first one with 500 people, the second will be 1,000 people, as largest delivered poll ever, and hopefully we'll do with hundreds of thousands in the future. Is that when you don't talk about candidates, you have Democrats realize they hold Republican positions in X, Y, and Z issue, and Republicans realize they hold Democratic issues in A, B, and C issue. And surprise, some people don't fall through direct party lines, and that's okay. And the very first US Congress was a third left, a third center, and a third right. Obviously, there were different party names at the time, but the equivalents were. And that's really a more reasonable makeup for what our country actually is. So the question is just how can we use programs and technologies and different legislative structures and platforms to return us to the kind of human nature we already are, as opposed to being, I would say not too strongly, preyed upon by algorithms that are smarter than our human brains, and media systems that are incredibly corrosive towards a good faith dialogue and debate. And we can do it. It just requires the buy-in and the cultural change to get it done. And it requires a kind of sobering look on the role of big tech in our society now.
Well, with that, thank you, Henry. And with that, we're running out of time. So I want to thank our panelists. And I also want to thank the 92nd Street Y and Newmark Civic Life series for bringing us together and for making this conversation something that people can participate in, not just today, but in the future as they listen in to this recording. So with that, thank you, everybody. And God bless our democracy.